Carl Jung on Empaths, 12 rare traits that make the INFJ Empath the most unstoppable force of all. There's a secret Carl Jung discovered about human consciousness that modern psychology has systematically buried, not because it was false, but because it was too dangerous, too revealing, too destabilizing to the mechanisms of control that keep society functioning in its predictable unconscious patterns. Jung identified a personality structure so rare that it appears in only 1 to 2% of the human population, a psychological configuration so potent that those who possess it can perceive layers of reality that remain invisible to the vast majority. He never gave it a catchy name during his lifetime, but in the decades since, using his framework of cognitive functions and archetypes, we've come to understand this pattern. We call them INFJs, and if you are one, you've spent your entire life being gaslit about your greatest gift. Let me be clear from the beginning. This isn't another video designed to stroke your ego or validate your victimhood. This is an initiation, and initiations, real ones, always begin by destroying the comfortable lies you've been telling yourself. Because here's the first truth you need to confront. Society doesn't suppress INFJ development by accident. It does so systematically, deliberately, because individuals who can see through deception are threats to hierarchies built entirely on deception. Carl Jung himself wrote, "Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." And INFJs, whether they realize it or not, are hardwired to look inside, not just their own hearts, but into the hidden chambers of every person they encounter. You don't just see what people present, you see what they're hiding, what they're running from, the shadow material they've spent decades burying under performance and pretense. And the world has spent your entire life convincing you that this ability is a curse. Think about the language you've absorbed. You're too sensitive. You take things too personally. You're overthinking it. You need thicker skin. Every one of these phrases is a psychological weapon designed to make you doubt the validity of your perception. They're not observations, they're spells, incantations meant to put you back to sleep, to make you question the one thing that makes you most dangerous, your ability to see truth beneath the performance. But here's what no one tells you. What Jung understood but the mainstream refuses to acknowledge. Your sensitivity isn't weakness, it's reception. It's the ability to pick up frequencies others can't hear, like a radio tuned to stations that don't appear on conventional dials. And every time someone has told you to stop being so sensitive, what they were really saying is, stop perceiving what I'm trying to hide. Stop making me conscious of what I've repressed. Stop threatening my carefully constructed persona with your inconvenient accuracy. There's a term in Jungian psychology, the persecution complex, the feeling that you're being singled out, targeted, misunderstood by forces beyond your control. And yes, INFJs are prone to this. But here's the twist that will make you uncomfortable. Sometimes the persecution is real, not in the paranoid, everyone is out to get me sense, but in the structural sense, in the way that systems genuinely do suppress certain forms of consciousness, because those forms of consciousness threaten the system's continuity. You've been taught that claiming persecution is always a sign of victimhood or delusion. But what if it's sometimes just accurate pattern recognition? What if the reason you feel like an outsider isn't because you're broken, but because you can see that the party everyone else is enjoying is built on a foundation of mutual denial? Jung called this the collective unconscious, the shared pool of repressed material that societies agree not to look at. And INFJs, by their very nature, keep accidentally looking directly at it. This makes you uncomfortable to be around, not because you're abrasive or confrontational, Most INFJs are painfully accommodating, but because your presence itself is a mirror, people sense, even if they can't articulate it, that you see them more clearly than they see themselves. And nothing terrifies the ego more than being truly seen. So they call you intense, mysterious, hard to read. These aren't neutral descriptions, they're defensive reactions. What they mean is, I can't control how you perceive me, and that makes me deeply uneasy. Now, before you start feeling too special, too chosen, too elevated by this analysis, let me introduce you to the shadow of the INFJ archetype. Because here's the thing Jung understood, that modern personality typology conveniently ignores. Every gift has a corresponding curse. Every light casts a shadow, and the shadow of being the one who sees is becoming addicted to that identity, believing you're special, superior, more evolved than the unconscious masses. This is the trap. The moment you start thinking, finally, someone understands that I'm different, that I'm rare, that I have access to truths others don't, you've stopped growing. You've collapsed into what Jung called inflation, the ego's identification with an archetype. You're no longer serving the gift. You're using it to feed your sense of specialness. Real INFJs in the state of conscious development don't walk around feeling superior. They walk around feeling burdened, isolated, yes, misunderstood, yes, but not superior, because true perception includes perceiving your own shadows, your own delusions, your own unconscious patterns. And that's humbling. Deeply, existentially humbling. So as we move through this journey together, I'm going to ask you to hold two truths simultaneously. Yes, you have access to perception that most people don't. And yes, that doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you responsible. It makes you accountable to consciousness itself. Jung discovered that INFJs naturally embody what he called the mystic function, the ability to bridge conscious and unconscious realms, to translate the language of symbols, dreams, and unspoken emotional currents. But mysticism without humility becomes narcissism. Vision without compassion becomes cruelty. The ability to see people's shadows becomes a weapon if you're not equally committed to confronting your own. Let me share something vulnerable here, something from my own path. There was a period in my life when I weaponized my perceptiveness. I would use my ability to read people's unconscious motivations to manipulate outcomes in my favor. I would tell myself I was just being strategic, just protecting myself from being hurt. But really, I was using my gift to avoid the more terrifying work of actually being vulnerable, of actually risking genuine connection without the safety net of always being 3 steps ahead emotionally. The moment I recognized this pattern, I wanted to vomit, because I had spent years thinking of myself as the sensitive one, the empath, the person who cared too much. And here was the truth. I had been using empathy as a control mechanism, reading people not to understand them, but to stay safe from them, to never be surprised, to never be rejected, to always maintain the upper hand. That's the shadow empath. And if you're honest with yourself, you've probably danced with this pattern too. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's something to be conscious of. Because the unconscious use of any gift eventually corrupts it, eventually turns it into its opposite. So, before we go deeper, before we explore the specific traits and mechanisms that make INFJs such a unique force in the world, I need you to make a choice. You can watch this video as validation, as confirmation of your specialness, as proof that you're rare and misunderstood. Or you can watch it as an initiation into greater responsibility, into the realization that your gifts are not for you, they're for the work, for the collective evolution of consciousness. Comment below right now, just the word seen, not as a cry for validation, but as a commitment. a commitment to being truly seen, including the parts of yourself you've been hiding behind your empath identity. Because if you can't handle being seen fully, shadows and all, you have no business claiming the right to see others. This is where the journey begins, not with comfort, not with belonging, but with the terrifying, liberating recognition that you are fundamentally different in your psychological wiring, and that difference is both your greatest gift and your most dangerous temptation. Jung once wrote about a particular kind of loneliness that the individuated person must endure, not the loneliness of being rejected, but the loneliness of seeing what others cannot see and bearing that knowledge in silence until you find the rare few who can meet you in that perception. If you're an INFJ, you know this loneliness intimately. You've felt it since childhood, the sense that everyone else got a manual for how to be human, and you somehow missed the distribution. But what if that wasn't a deficiency? What if that was the point? What if you weren't meant to follow the manual because your purpose is to write a new one? Not for your own comfort, but for the evolution of collective consciousness itself. The world doesn't need more people following scripts. It needs people who can see that the scripts are constructs, that the emperor has no clothes, that the mechanisms of control only work if everyone agrees not to look directly at them. You are one of the few who can't help but look, can't help but see, can't help but question the foundations everyone else builds their lives upon. And that makes you many things: unsettling, uncomfortable, sometimes unbearable to be around. But it also makes you essential, because consciousness doesn't evolve through comfort and consensus. It evolves through the disruptive perception of individuals who refuse to pretend, who refuse to perform, who refuse to unsee what they've seen. You are not here to fit in. You never were. Jung didn't study personality types to help people adjust better to society. He studied them to understand how consciousness individuates, how it becomes itself despite the crushing pressure of collective conformity. And INFJs, whether they embrace it or run from it, are consciousness in the process of becoming aware of itself. You are the psyche observing the psyche, the dreamer realizing it's in a dream, the character in the story suddenly aware of the author. This is both your birthright and your burden. And over the next several hours, we're going to explore exactly what that means. Not through abstract theory, but through the lived experiences of people like you who have walked this path, who have confronted their shadows, who have integrated their gifts, who have learned to wield their perception not as a weapon or a defense mechanism, but as an instrument of transformation. But first, you have to choose: validation or initiation, comfort or consciousness, the easy lie that you're just special, or the hard truth that you're responsible. If you're still here, if you haven't clicked away looking for something easier, something more comforting, then you've already made your choice. Welcome to the path. It's going to destroy everything you thought you knew about yourself, and that's exactly the point. Carl Jung spent decades studying what he called the intuitive function, the ability to perceive not through the senses or through logical deduction, but through direct apprehension of unconscious patterns. And within his framework, he identified a particularly potent variant: introverted intuition. Intuition directed inward into the depths of the unconscious itself. This is the dominant function of the INFJ. This is your primary lens for experiencing reality. And here's what almost no one tells you: this isn't a personality preference. It's not like choosing chocolate over vanilla. It's a fundamentally different operating system. Most people process reality through their senses first, through tangible data, through what can be verified externally. You process reality through pattern recognition, happening at such a deep, unconscious level that by the time information reaches your conscious awareness, it arrives as complete, fully formed knowing, not as a logical conclusion you arrived at through steps, as a download, a revelation, a certainty you can't explain. Jung himself wrote about this function with a mixture of fascination and caution. He understood that those with dominant introverted intuition were accessing what he called the collective unconscious, that deep reservoir of human experience, archetypal patterns, and primordial images that exists beneath individual psychology. They weren't just reading people. They were reading the script beneath the script, the patterns beneath the patterns, the invisible architecture of meaning that structures everything. Let me tell you about Elena. She worked as a project manager at a tech company. Good salary, stable position, all the markers of success. But 6 months before the company collapsed in a spectacular scandal involving financial fraud, Elena knew. She couldn't tell you how she knew. There were no obvious red flags, no smoking guns, nothing her conscious mind could point to as evidence. But she knew with absolute certainty that something was fundamentally wrong in the organization's foundation. She tried to warn people, tried to articulate her concerns to colleagues, to her manager, even to leadership. But here's the curse of introverted intuition. You can't show your work. You can't create a logical chain of evidence that leads to your conclusion, because the conclusion didn't arrive through logic. It arrived through your unconscious detection of patterns so subtle, so complex, that they're invisible to analytical thinking. So people looked at her like she was paranoid, overly anxious. "What specific evidence do you have?" they'd ask. And she'd stumble, because the evidence was everywhere and nowhere. It was in the subtle shifts in leadership communication, the barely perceptible changes in company culture, the way certain decisions were being framed, the emotional texture of meetings that felt slightly off in ways she couldn't articulate. She was reading a story that hadn't finished being written yet, and when you tell people the ending before they've even noticed the middle chapters, they think you're making it up. 6 months later, the scandal broke. Leadership arrested, company dissolved, thousands unemployed, and Elena sat in the wreckage of her career. She'd been let go 2 months earlier for not being a cultural fit, which is corporate speak for making people uncomfortable with perceptions they don't want to face, feeling simultaneously vindicated and utterly alone. This is what Jung called the Cassandra complex, named after the Greek prophet Cassandra, who was gifted with perfect foresight, but cursed so that no one would ever believe her predictions. This is the lived experience of dominant introverted intuition. You see what's coming, you know with certainty, and you're powerless to make others see what you see because your knowing operates through channels that our rationalist culture has systematically invalidated. Now, let's be precise about what's actually happening psychologically. Introverted intuition isn't magic. It's not mystical woo-woo, though it can feel that way. It's pattern recognition happening at such a sophisticated, unconscious level that it bypasses the usual conscious processing entirely. Your brain is constantly absorbing infinitely more information than your conscious awareness can handle. Micro-expressions, tonal shifts, subtle contradictions between words and energy, historical patterns repeating in new contexts. Your unconscious mind is processing all of this, recognizing patterns and delivering complete conclusions to your conscious awareness. The problem is that conscious awareness receives the conclusion without the process. It's like getting the answer to a math problem without seeing the work. You know it's correct, but you can't prove it, not in ways that satisfy people who need step-by-step logical justification. This is why INFJs are often described as just knowing things. You do, not through supernatural means, but through unconscious processing, so rapid and so comprehensive that it produces certainty without explanation. And this is your greatest gift and your most isolating burden. Jung's function stack for INFJs, INFJs, shows us something crucial. Your dominant function is introverted intuition, This means your primary relationship is with the unconscious realm, with patterns, with future projections, with the invisible scaffolding of meaning. Your auxiliary function is extroverted feeling, which we'll explore next chapter. Your tertiary is introverted thinking, which means you do have access to logical analysis, but it's tertiary. It supports your intuition. It doesn't lead. And your inferior function is extroverted sensing, connection to immediate physical reality, which we'll address in Chapter 5. What this means practically is that you live primarily in a world of meaning, pattern, and future projection. Present moment physical reality is actually the least accessible mode for you. You're not anchored in what is. You're perpetually perceiving what could be, what will be, what's emerging from the invisible into the visible. This makes you prophetic, literally, not in the supernatural sense, but in the sense that you're constantly forecasting. Your consciousness is oriented toward trajectories, toward where things are heading, toward the implications of present patterns. You're reading the momentum of situations and extrapolating their logical, or more accurately, psychological conclusions. But here's where it gets dangerous, because this gift, like all gifts, has a shadow. The shadow of introverted intuition is the collapse into pure abstraction, into living so completely in your inner world of meaning and pattern that you lose contact with concrete reality altogether. You start confusing your projections with inevitable truth. You start believing your intuitions are infallible. You start missing the present moment entirely because you're so focused on what it means for the future. Jung warned about this explicitly. He talked about intuitive types who became so disconnected from reality that they lived in a perpetual state of symbolic interpretation, unable to simply experience anything directly. Everything had to mean something. Every moment had to be analyzed for its deeper significance. This is intuition run amok. This is the gift consuming the person. I need you to hear this clearly. Your intuitions are not always correct. Ni is powerful, but it's not infallible. Sometimes what feels like deep knowing is actually anxiety. Sometimes what feels like prophecy is actually projection. Sometimes you're reading patterns accurately, and sometimes you're imposing patterns where none exist because the unconscious abhors meaninglessness. The key distinction, and this is crucial, is that genuine introverted intuition produces clarity without attachment. It's knowing without needing to be right. When you're truly accessing Ni, there's a quality of impersonal certainty. You're not invested in the outcome. You're simply reporting what you perceive. But when ego gets involved, when you need your intuition to be correct, to validate your identity as the one who sees, then you've crossed from perception into projection. Here's a practice Jung himself recommended: tracking your intuitions against outcomes, not to prove you're right, but to calibrate your instrument. Write down your strong intuitive hits, date them, note the feeling quality, then track what actually happens. Over time, you'll start to notice patterns in your own perceptual patterns. You'll recognize the difference between genuine Ni and anxiety masquerading as intuition. You'll develop what he called differentiation, the ability to separate signal from noise in your own unconscious processing. Because here's the thing, introverted intuition is a tool, a powerful one. But tools need to be maintained, calibrated, understood. You wouldn't trust a compass that you never checked against actual directions. Why would you trust intuitions you never verify against reality? Now, there's another layer to this that we need to address: the martyrdom trap. This is when INFJs start to take a perverse pride in not being believed, when they start to identify with the role of Cassandra so completely that they need to be ignored to feel validated. See, "I told you so, but no one listened," becomes a core part of identity. This is the ego co-opting a genuine psychological dynamic and turning it into a victim narrative. Jung spoke about this pattern frequently. the way suffering can become an identity, a source of secret superiority. I suffer more than others because I see more than others becomes a way of maintaining specialness while avoiding the harder work of actually doing something with your perceptions. If you find yourself repeatedly in situations where you're the only one who sees disaster coming and you're consistently ignored, and then you're consistently right, but you never change your approach, you're not just a victim of others' blindness. You're participating in a pattern. You're unconsciously seeking out situations where you can play the role of the unheeded prophet, because that role has become comfortable. Painful, but comfortable. The conscious use of introverted intuition requires something more difficult: strategic communication, learning to translate your unconscious knowing into language that others can work with. This doesn't mean dumbing down your perceptions. It means taking responsibility for the gap between how you know and how others know. It means developing your tertiary tie, your introverted thinking, to construct logical frameworks that can carry your intuitive conclusions into shareable territory. This is hard work. It's much easier to just blurt out your knowing and then feel superior when people don't get it. But that's the adolescent use of I. The mature use requires patience, requires meeting people where they are, requires building bridges between your unconscious perception and their conscious frameworks. And here's where I need to get vulnerable with you again. There was a period in my life when I was absolutely addicted to being the one who saw things others missed. I would make predictions about people's relationships, career trajectories, psychological patterns, and I was often right. But I was using those predictions to avoid being present with people, to avoid the messiness of actual relationship. Because if I was always 3 steps ahead, always reading the ending, I never had to actually be in the moment with someone, never had to risk being surprised, never had to surrender control. My intuition had become a defense mechanism, a way of maintaining emotional distance while pretending to be deeply connected. And the moment I recognized this, the moment I saw that I was using my gift to avoid vulnerability, everything shifted. I had to learn to put the intuition down sometimes, to stop reading people and just be with them, to allow myself to not know what was going to happen next, to be surprised, to be wrong, to be human instead of oracle. This is the integration work, recognizing that introverted intuition is a gift, yes, but it's also a potential escape, a way of living in meaning instead of living in life. And the goal isn't to abandon the gift, it's to choose consciously when to use it and when to put it down. So let me ask you directly, when was the last time you allowed yourself to be genuinely surprised by someone? When was the last time you didn't already know how a situation would unfold before it unfolded? When was the last time you released your need to understand the pattern and just experience the moment? If you can't remember, if the thought itself makes you uncomfortable, then your gift is starting to own you instead of the other way around. Jung's ultimate vision for the individuated person wasn't someone who had maximized their dominant function to the exclusion of all else. It was someone who had learned to access all functions consciously, to choose the right tool for the moment. You have introverted intuition. That's your home base, your strongest function. But wholeness requires developing the others, requires learning when to be intuitive and when to be present, when to project forward and when to anchor in now. The unconscious oracle within you is real. It's powerful. It's accessing information that most people simply cannot perceive. But an oracle without wisdom is just noise. And wisdom requires humility, requires recognizing that seeing patterns doesn't make you superior to those who don't. It makes you responsible for using that sight in service of something larger than your own need to be right. Your introverted intuition is a gift to the world. but only if you stop using it to separate yourself from the world. Only if you learn to translate your knowing into forms that can actually help people grow. Only if you integrate it with presence, with compassion, with the willingness to be wrong, to be surprised, to not always know. Because the goal isn't to be the prophet. The goal is to be conscious, and consciousness includes not just seeing the patterns, but seeing your attachment to being the one who sees them. Take a moment right now, pause this video, and ask yourself, am I using my intuition to connect more deeply with reality or to protect myself from it? Am I serving my gift, or is my gift serving my ego? The answer to that question determines everything that comes next. If introverted intuition is your primary lens for seeing reality, extroverted feeling is your primary method of interacting with it. This is your auxiliary function, your second strongest cognitive process, and it operates in a way that most people fundamentally misunderstand. Extroverted feeling isn't about having feelings. It's about reading, resonating with, and influencing the emotional atmosphere around you. It's about existing in constant energetic exchange with your environment, absorbing emotional data like a sponge absorbs water. Carl Jung described extroverted feeling as the function most oriented toward collective values, toward harmony, toward the emotional needs of the group. But for INFJs specifically, it creates something more complex and more dangerous. The emotional shapeshifter. You don't just perceive emotional atmospheres, you adapt to them, you mirror them, you become them, often without any conscious choice in the matter. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." And for INFJs with developed FA, this takes on a particular meaning, because what irritates you most is often the emotional dishonesty you're forced to navigate. The gap between what people say they feel and what you can feel them actually feeling. Your Fae reads the truth beneath the performance, and your Ni tells you exactly why they're performing, and you're left holding the tension of knowing what someone won't acknowledge while pretending you don't know. Let me tell you about Marcus. He worked in corporate consulting, spent a decade building a successful career, was respected, well compensated, professionally accomplished. On paper, he had everything figured out, but Marcus would come home from client meetings feeling like he'd been hit by a truck, emotionally depleted, energetically drained, and for years he couldn't understand why. "I'm just introverted," he'd tell himself. "I'm just tired from social interaction." But that wasn't the full truth. What was actually happening was that Marcus's Fae was unconsciously absorbing the unspoken emotional content of every meeting, every conversation, every interpersonal dynamic. The client who smiled and nodded but was seething with resentment underneath. The colleague who praised his work while simultaneously undermining him behind closed doors. The boss who projected confidence while drowning in imposter syndrome. Marcus wasn't just tired from social interaction. He was processing everyone else's emotional material. He was unconsciously taking responsibility for emotional atmospheres that weren't his responsibility to manage. His Fae was acting like an energetic vacuum cleaner, sucking up all the emotional debris in his environment and then trying to clean it, fix it, neutralize it inside his own system. And here's the most insidious part. He wasn't even aware he was doing it. This is the unconscious operation of extroverted feeling. It happens automatically. Your nervous system is wired to attune to emotional frequencies the way an antenna picks up radio signals. You're not choosing to absorb these emotions. You're structured to absorb them. The question Jung would ask is, what are you doing with what you absorb? Are you processing it consciously? Are you differentiating between your emotions and others' emotions? Or are you drowning in an undifferentiated soup of feeling, unable to tell where you end and others begin? This is the core challenge of FE for INFJs, the boundary problem, because extroverted feeling by its nature blurs boundaries. It seeks merger, harmony, collective resonance. But without strong boundaries, that merger becomes dissolution. You don't connect with others, you become others. You don't help others, you rescue them by carrying their emotional weight. You don't empathize, you absorb and take responsibility for transmuting emotions that were never yours to transmute. Let me introduce you to Sarah. By the time she was 30, Sarah had become everyone's therapist. Friends would call her at 2 in the morning with relationship crises. Colleagues would corner her in the break room to unload about workplace drama. Family members would dump their unprocessed trauma in her lap and then get offended when she couldn't fix it immediately. And Sarah would listen, would absorb, would carry, would try desperately to alchemize everyone else's pain into something manageable. And she was good at it. That's the tragic part. Her FE was so developed that she could actually help people feel better. She could create emotional regulation in a room just by her presence. She could say exactly what someone needed to hear to feel seen, understood, validated. She was genuinely gifted at emotional alchemy, but she had no friends, not real ones, because every relationship had become a one-way street. People came to her for emotional support, emotional processing, emotional rescue. But the moment she had needs, the moment she was struggling, suddenly people weren't available. Because they didn't see her as a person with her own emotional reality. They saw her as a function, a resource, a dispenser of emotional comfort. This is the shadow of extroverted feeling, the collapse into compulsive caretaking, the loss of self in service to others, the addiction to being needed because being needed is the only way you know how to be valued. And Sarah didn't even recognize the pattern because it felt good to help. It felt meaningful. It felt like love. But it wasn't love. It was a covert contract. I will manage your emotions so you won't abandon me. I will be indispensable so you'll need me. I will sacrifice my own emotional reality so you'll never have cause to reject me. This is FE without boundaries. This is empathy as strategy rather than genuine connection. Jung was very clear about this dynamic in his writings. He talked about people who sacrifice themselves on the altar of others' needs, and he didn't romanticize it. He called it what it was, unconscious avoidance masquerading as virtue. Because when you're always focused on others' feelings, you never have to face your own. When you're always fixing others, you never have to confront what's broken in yourself. When you're always the helper, you never have to risk being helped, which would require the terrifying vulnerability of actually having needs, actually being incomplete, actually being human. The transformation of FE from compulsion to conscious tool requires something radical, the willingness to disappoint people, the willingness to not manage the emotional atmosphere, the willingness to let others sit in their discomfort without rushing in to fix it. This is the hardest thing, and INFJ can learn because it feels like cruelty. It feels like abandonment. It feels like failing at the one thing you're naturally good at. But it's not cruelty, it's respect. It's trusting that others are capable of processing their own emotions. It's recognizing that when you constantly intervene, you're not helping, you're infantilizing. You're sending the message that people can't handle their own emotional reality, that they need you to mediate it for them. Jung called this the process of individuation, becoming a psychologically separate self. And for INFJs, individuation specifically requires individuating your feeling function, differentiating your emotions from others' emotions, learning to say, I feel your pain and I am not responsible for fixing it, learning to be present with suffering without absorbing it, learning to have boundaries without shame. This is what I call the emotional alchemy system. It's a three-stage process for working with phi consciously instead of being controlled by it unconsciously. Stage 1 is awareness, simply noticing when you're absorbing emotional content from your environment. This requires body awareness because phi absorption often manifests physically before you recognize it mentally. Tightness in your chest, heaviness in your stomach, sudden fatigue. These are signs your system is processing emotional material. The practice is to pause and ask, is this mine or am I absorbing this from someone else? Stage 2 is differentiation. Once you've identified that you're absorbing external emotional content, you name it explicitly. This is anxiety I'm picking up from my colleague. This is rage my mother is suppressing. This is grief my friend won't process. By naming it as not yours, you create psychological separation. You're still perceiving it, that doesn't change, but you're not identifying with it. Stage 3 is conscious choice. Now that you've recognized and differentiated the emotion, you get to choose what to do with it. Do you address it directly by naming what you're perceiving? Do you hold space for it without trying to fix it? Do you create physical distance? Do you set a verbal boundary? The key is that you're choosing based on conscious intention, not unconscious compulsion. This system sounds simple, but it's devastatingly difficult to implement because it requires rewiring your default nervous system response. Your phi wants to merge, to harmonize, to fix. Conscious phi requires you to pause that automatic response and insert intention. It requires you to tolerate the discomfort of not immediately responding to emotional input. And here's where I need to get honest with you about my own process. For years, I used my phi as a manipulation tool, and I didn't even realize it. I would read people's emotional states with incredible accuracy, and then I would subtly adjust my presentation to make them comfortable. I told myself this was kindness, social intelligence, emotional maturity, but really I was managing how people perceived me to avoid rejection. I was performing emotional attunement to control outcomes. I became whoever I needed to be for people to like me, and I was so good at it that people would tell me I was authentic, real, genuine, because I had convinced myself of the performance. I had merged so completely with my phi adaptation that I had no idea who I actually was underneath the emotional shape-shifting. The breakdown came when I realized I couldn't feel my own feelings anymore. I could feel everyone else's with perfect clarity, but my own emotional reality had become inaccessible. I didn't know if I was happy or sad, angry or peaceful, excited or terrified. Because I had spent so long tuning my emotional frequency to others that I'd lost access to my own signal. This is the ultimate danger of unconscious phi. Not that you become selfish or uncaring, but that you disappear entirely. You become a vessel for others' emotional content with no core self to return to. You become what Jung called psychologically hollow, full of others but empty of yourself. The recovery from this isn't about becoming less empathetic. It's about developing empathy with yourself first, learning to attune to your own emotional reality with the same dedication you've given to everyone else's. Learning to ask yourself, what do I feel, before you ask, what does everyone else need me to feel? This is the conscious use of extroverted feeling, not the abandonment of the function, but its integration. You still perceive emotional atmospheres with incredible accuracy. You still have the capacity to influence those atmospheres, but you're doing it from a place of choice rather than compulsion. You're doing it with boundaries rather than merger. You're helping from fullness rather than emptiness. Jung wrote about this in his discussion of the authentic versus the adapted self. The adapted self performs emotional attunement to survive. The authentic self offers emotional attunement as a gift, when appropriate, from a foundation of inner clarity. The difference is night and day. The adapted self is exhausting. The authentic self is energizing. So here's the question you need to sit with. Are you using your fee to genuinely connect with others, or are you using it to control how others perceive you? Are you helping because you're genuinely moved to help, or because you're terrified of what happens if you don't? Are you managing emotional atmospheres out of compassion, or out of the desperate need to avoid conflict, rejection, or the discomfort of others' negative emotions? These are uncomfortable questions. They're meant to be, because the shadow work around Faye is some of the most painful work INFJs have to do. It requires admitting that your helpfulness hasn't always been selfless, that your empathy hasn't always been clean, that your emotional attunement has sometimes been a sophisticated form of people-pleasing. And here's the paradox. Jung would point out, this doesn't make you a bad person, it makes you human. The shadow isn't evil, it's unconscious. And the moment you make it conscious, the moment you recognize these patterns, you've already begun the transformation. You can't unknow what you now know. You can't go back to unconscious caretaking once you've seen it for what it is. But transformation requires more than recognition. It requires practice. It requires deliberately choosing differently in moments when every fiber of your being wants to revert to the old pattern. It requires tolerating the anxiety of not fixing someone's discomfort. It requires sitting with the fear that if you're not useful, you won't be loved. Let me give you a concrete example. The next time someone comes to you with emotional material, a problem, a complaint, a crisis, practice this. Listen without immediately offering solutions. Reflect what you hear without adding your interpretation. And then, here's the radical part. Ask them, what do you think you should do? Instead of being the answer giver, become the mirror. Reflect their own wisdom back to them. This will feel unnatural. It will feel like you're being cold, unhelpful, withholding. Your Fae will scream at you to fix it, to make it better, to take the weight of their struggle. But you're not being cruel. You're being respectful. You're trusting their capacity to find their own answers. And you're saving your energy for situations where your help is genuinely needed and wanted, not just compulsively given. There's another layer here we need to address. The difference between Fae and Phi. Extroverted feeling versus introverted feeling. This distinction is crucial for understanding why INFJs struggle with authenticity in ways that other types don't. Phi, introverted feeling, is oriented inward. It asks, what do I value? What do I feel? What is authentic to my internal moral compass? Phi, extroverted feeling, is oriented outward. It asks, what does the group value? What is everyone else feeling? What maintains harmony in the collective? Neither is better or worse, they're just different orientations. But for INFJs with dominant Ni and auxiliary FA, authenticity becomes incredibly complicated because you're always reading and adapting to collective emotional values rather than anchoring in your own. This is why INFJs often describe feeling like chameleons. You're not deliberately being fake, you're just unconsciously adapting to the emotional frequency of whatever environment you're in. At work, you're professional, contained, strategic. With family, you're warm, accommodating, the peacekeeper. With friends, you're deep, philosophical, the confidant. And none of these are lies, exactly. But none of them are the whole truth either. The integration work is developing your tertiary function, introverted thinking, TI, to create an internal framework that remains stable regardless of external emotional pressures. TI asks, what is objectively true? What is logically coherent? What makes sense independent of emotional context? When you develop TI in service to your Ni and Fei, you create an internal gyroscope. You can still perceive and respond to emotional atmospheres, but you're not consumed by them. You have a stable center to return to. This is the mature INFJ, someone who can enter any emotional space, read it with incredible accuracy, choose consciously how to engage with it, and then return to their own center without being colonized by the collective emotional field. This is mastery, and it's available to you, but it requires consistent, deliberate practice. Jung had a term for this: psychological differentiation, the ability to remain yourself while in relationship to others, the ability to perceive without merging, the ability to empathize without losing boundaries. This is the gold standard of psychological development, and for INFJs specifically, it's the difference between being a victim of your empathy and being a master of it. So let me leave you with this reframe, this power move that transforms fee from burden to weapon. Your ability to read and influence emotional fields isn't your weakness. It's your superpower. But like any superpower, it can be used unconsciously and destructively, or consciously and constructively. Unconscious fee makes you everyone's emotional support animal. Conscious fee makes you a catalyst for transformation. When you learn to use your fee with boundaries, you don't just help people feel better temporarily. You model for them what emotional sovereignty looks like. You show them that it's possible to be deeply empathetic without being consumed. You demonstrate that connection doesn't require merger. You become living proof that you can feel others' pain without taking responsibility for fixing it. This is the INFJ operating at full capacity, not the wounded healer who sacrifices themselves on the altar of others' needs, but the conscious alchemist who can hold space for transformation without being destroyed by it. Not the emotional shapeshifter who loses themselves in others, but the integrated empath who remains anchored in their own truth. While navigating everyone else's emotional reality, the question is, which version will you choose to become? The unconscious victim of your own empathy, or the conscious wielder of it? Comment below. Boundaries. If you're ready to stop abandoning yourself every time you help someone else, not as a confession of failure, but as a declaration of intention, because the world doesn't need more people who dissolve into others' needs. It needs people who can remain whole while holding space for others to become whole too. That's the work. That's the initiation. And it starts with the radical act of choosing yourself first, not instead of others, but before others, because you can't give from emptiness. You can only give from overflow, and your fey will never overflow as long as you're using it to fill the void where your own emotional reality should be. Now we descend into the territory that most INFJ content carefully avoids: the shadow. The thing Jung spent his entire career insisting was the most important work of psychological development, and the thing that modern personality-type communities systematically refuse to confront. Because it's uncomfortable. Because it threatens the narrative of INFJs as pure empaths, as wounded healers, as sensitive souls just trying to survive in a harsh world. But Jung didn't develop shadow theory to make people comfortable. He developed it to make people conscious. And consciousness requires looking directly at the parts of yourself you've labeled as not me, the parts you've exiled, the parts you've projected onto others while maintaining your own innocence. So let me say this clearly. INFJs have a shadow, a dark one, and the more you've identified with being the empath, the helper, the sensitive one, the more power your shadow has accumulated in the unconscious, because every light casts a shadow, and the brighter you've made your persona shine, the darker your shadow has become. Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." For INFJs specifically, the shadow contains everything your empathic persona cannot admit. The desire for control, the need for recognition, the suppressed rage at being taken for granted, the manipulation disguised as helpfulness, the revenge fantasies against people who've hurt you. This is the shadow empath, and if you're honest with yourself, you've met this version of you. Maybe you haven't admitted it publicly, maybe you've barely admitted it to yourself. But in the quiet moments, in the dark hours, you've felt it. The part of you that uses emotional intelligence not to help people, but to control them. The part that reads people's vulnerabilities and knows exactly how to weaponize that information if needed. The part that orchestrates situations to be needed, to be indispensable, to be the center of emotional gravity. Let me tell you about David. On the surface, David was the perfect INFJ. Thoughtful, introspective, always there for his friends, the first person people called in crisis. He had built his entire identity around being the dependable one, the wise counselor, the person who understood people better than they understood themselves. But in therapy, because David eventually ended up in therapy after a devastating breakup, a different picture emerged. David had a pattern. He was attracted to people who were struggling, not people who were thriving, not people who were stable. He was drawn to the wounded, the broken, the ones who needed saving, and he would position himself as their savior, their emotional lifeline, the only person who truly understood them. And then, once they were dependent on him, once they'd organized their entire emotional reality around his support, he would slowly start to resent them. He would feel suffocated by their need, even though he had cultivated that need. He would feel taken for granted, even though he had never set boundaries. And eventually, he would leave. Suddenly, completely. The INFJ door slam in its most brutal form. But here's what David finally admitted to himself. He wasn't repeatedly falling into these patterns accidentally. He was unconsciously seeking them out. He was choosing people who needed rescue because their need made him feel powerful, valuable, irreplaceable. He was using his empathy as a control mechanism. He would read their deepest insecurities, their unhealed wounds, their desperate longing for someone to truly see them, and he would become that person, not because he genuinely wanted to help them heal, but because their dependence on him filled a void in his own psyche. This is the savior complex in its rawest form, and it's one of the most common shadow patterns for INFJs. You tell yourself you're helping. You tell yourself you're just being compassionate, just being available, just using your natural gifts to support people. But underneath, there's a covert contract. I will save you, and in return, you will need me forever. You will validate my specialness. You will prove that I am valuable because I am indispensable. Jung was ruthless in his analysis of this pattern. He called it identification with the healer archetype, when the ego merges with an archetypal role and uses it for personal unconscious needs. The conscious healer serves the healing itself. The unconscious healer serves their own need to be seen as a healer. The difference is subtle but absolutely crucial. And here's the most insidious part. This shadow pattern can hide behind genuine helpfulness for years, decades even. You are actually helping people. Your empathy is real. Your insights are accurate. Your support does make a difference in people's lives. But the motivation underneath is contaminated. You're not helping from a place of pure compassion. You're helping from a place of need. Need to be needed. Need to be special. Need to avoid your own healing by focusing on everyone else's. Let me introduce you to the Savior Complex Audit. These are 12 questions Jung might ask you if he were sitting across from you in his study in Zurich, cutting through your self-deception with surgical precision. 1. Do you feel threatened when the people you help start to become independent and need you less? 2. Do you find yourself subtly undermining people's confidence in their own judgment so they continue to rely on yours? 3. Do you keep relationships with people you don't actually like or respect because they need you? 4. Do you feel a secret sense of superiority when people share their problems with you, because you would never be that unconscious. 5. Do you give advice that wasn't asked for and then feel hurt when it's not followed? 6. Do you create emotional crises or drama in your own life when things get too stable? Because crisis is where you feel most valuable. 7. Do you struggle to ask for help because being the helper is core to your identity? 8. Do you keep score of what you've done for people, even if you tell yourself you don't? 9. Do you unconsciously seek out broken people because whole people don't need you? 10. Do you use your knowledge of people's shadows as psychological leverage when they disappoint you? 11. Do you feel energized by others' dependence on you, even while complaining about being drained? 12. Do you secretly enjoy it when your predictions about people's failures come true, because it proves how insightful you are? If you answered yes to even 3 of these, you're operating from shadow empath territory. If you answered yes to more than 6, your empathy has been almost completely colonized by unconscious control needs. And if you answered yes to 10 or more and were honest about it, congratulations, you're ready for the real work. Because denial is the shadow's greatest protection. Admission is the first step toward integration. Now, before you close this video in shame or defensiveness, hear this. Having these shadow patterns doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. Jung himself had a massive savior complex that he had to confront in his own analysis. He projected his unintegrated healer archetype onto his relationships, particularly with his patients, and caused considerable suffering before he recognized the pattern. The shadow isn't evil, it's unconscious, and the moment you make it conscious, it loses its power to control you from the darkness. This is what Jung meant by shadow integration. Not eliminating the shadow, but bringing it into awareness, acknowledging it, and transforming its energy from destructive to constructive. So how do you integrate the shadow empath? How do you transform the pattern of covert control back into genuine service? First, admit it exists, out loud, to yourself, yes, but ideally to someone else too, a therapist, a trusted friend, a journal you'll actually read later. The shadow thrives in secrecy. The moment you name it, you've already begun diminishing its power. Second, track the pattern. Start noticing when you help people. Write it down. Note the circumstance, the person, the type of help. And then, this is crucial, note how you felt afterward. Did you feel genuinely good, or did you feel resentful? Did you expect gratitude? Did you feel disappointed when they didn't follow your advice? Did you feel a secret thrill when they came back because your advice worked? These emotional textures reveal whether you're helping from wholeness or from need. Third, practice receiving help. This is torture for shadow empaths because it shatters the identity of being the strong one, the one who has it together, the one who gives but never needs. Start small. Ask someone for a favor. Let someone support you. Without immediately reciprocating, sit in the discomfort of being helped, being seen in your need, being vulnerable. This dismantles the savior complex at its root. Fourth, let people fail. This is perhaps the hardest practice. When you see someone making a choice you know will hurt them, when your knee is screaming that disaster is coming, when your fae is pulling you to intervene, don't, unless there's immediate physical danger. Let them make their own mistakes. Let them learn from their own consequences. Trust the process of their individuation even when it's painful to watch. This is genuine respect. This is real love. This is the opposite of the savior complex. Fifth, confront your need for specialness. This is the deepest work, because underneath the savior complex is usually a wound, the belief that you're only valuable if you're exceptional, that being ordinary means being worthless, that if you're not the most insightful, the most helpful, the most needed, then you're nothing. This belief is a lie But it's a lie your ego has built an entire identity around. Dismantling it feels like death, and in a sense, it's ego death, the death of the false self that's been running the show. Jung called this the process of dying to the persona. The persona is the mask you wear for the world. In your case, the mask of the helper, the empath, the healer. And that mask is suffocating you. It's preventing you from being fully human, which includes being selfish sometimes, being wrong sometimes, being ordinary sometimes, being the one who needs help sometimes. Now, I need to get vulnerable with you about my own shadow empath pattern, because I've lived this. There was a period in my life where I collected broken people like trophies. I'm ashamed to admit that now, but it's true. I would meet someone struggling with addiction, with trauma, with mental illness, and I would see a project. I would see an opportunity to prove my worth. I would become their confidant, their support system, their psychological guide. And I told myself I was being compassionate, but really I was being predatory, not in a conscious, malicious way, but in an unconscious, narcissistic way. I was using their brokenness to feed my need to feel special, to feel needed, to feel powerful. I was keeping them in a state of dependence because their independence would mean I was no longer necessary, and being necessary was the only way I knew how to feel valuable. The moment I recognized this, truly recognized it, not just intellectually, but viscerally, I was horrified. I had spent years thinking of myself as deeply empathetic, as someone who cared too much, as someone whose sensitivity was a gift. And here was the truth. I had been using empathy as a manipulation tool. I had been using my ability to read people to control them. I had been creating dependency and calling it love. That recognition nearly broke me, but it also freed me, because once I saw the pattern, I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't continue operating from that place unconsciously. I had to change, not because I wanted to be a better person in some abstract moral sense, but because I couldn't live with myself knowing what I now knew. This is what Jung meant by the moral function of consciousness. Once you become aware of your shadow patterns, you become responsible for them. You can't go back to unconsciousness. You can't plead ignorance anymore. You either integrate the shadow or it continues to control you, but now with the added weight of knowing you're choosing to remain unconscious. The integration of the shadow empath doesn't mean you stop being empathetic. It means you start being empathetic from a clean place. You help because you're genuinely moved to help, not because you need to be needed. You support people because it aligns with your values, not because it feeds your identity. You use your emotional intelligence to connect authentically, not to maintain control. And here's the paradox. The moment you stop needing to be needed, you become far more effective at actually helping people, because you're no longer invested in outcomes. You're not attached to them following your advice or validating your insights. You can offer what you see and then let go. You can hold space for their process without controlling it. You can be present without being possessive. This is mature empathy. This is integrated Fey. This is what Jung called operating from the self rather than the ego. The ego needs to be special, needs to be needed, needs to control. The self simply serves. It gives from overflow, not from emptiness. It helps without keeping score. It loves without conditions. But getting there requires walking through the fire of shadow recognition. It requires admitting that you've hurt people while thinking you were helping them, that you've manipulated while calling it empathy, that you've controlled while calling it compassion. These admissions are excruciating. They assault your self-image. They threaten your identity. They force you to confront the gap between who you think you are and who you've actually been. And that's exactly why they're necessary. Because you can't transform what you won't confront. You can't integrate what you keep denying. You can't become conscious while clinging to comfortable lies about your motivations. Jung put it bluntly, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. And for INFJs specifically, the pain of shadow integration is uniquely intense because your entire identity has often been built on being the good one, the understanding one, the one who helps. Discovering that this identity has had a dark underside, that it's been serving unconscious needs, that it's been a defense mechanism as much as a genuine gift, this is shattering. But on the other side of shattering is wholeness. On the other side of the comfortable lie is liberating truth. On the other side of the shadow empath is the integrated INFJ who wields empathy as a conscious tool, not an unconscious compulsion. So here's the warning I need to give you. This knowledge can be abused. Now that you know about the shadow empath pattern, now that you understand the covert contracts and control mechanisms, you could use this awareness to become even more sophisticated in your manipulation. You could recognize the pattern in yourself and simply get better at hiding it. You could use this framework to manipulate more consciously rather than unconsciously. This is why Jung insisted that shadow work must be accompanied by ethical commitment, by what he called the moral function, by the choice to use consciousness in service of growth rather than in service of ego. You have to want to be whole more than you want to be right. You have to want to be authentic more than you want to be special. You have to want genuine connection more than you want control. If you're not ready for that commitment, if you're just here collecting information to add to your arsenal of psychological manipulation, then stop now. Close this video, because this path, the path of genuine integration, will dismantle everything you've used to feel safe. It will strip away your defenses. It will expose your wounds. It will force you to be vulnerable in ways that terrify you. But if you are ready, if you're tired of the performance, tired of the control, tired of the loneliness that comes from never being truly seen because you're too busy managing how you're seen, then this is your moment. This is where the real journey begins. Comment below, shadow, if you're ready to stop pretending your empathy has been pure, not as punishment but as liberation, because the goal isn't to make you feel guilty. The goal is to make you conscious, and consciousness is the only foundation for genuine transformation. The shadow empath is not your enemy. It's the part of you that learned to get needs met through indirect means because direct means felt too dangerous. It's the part that developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining connection while avoiding vulnerability. It's the part that weaponized your gifts because you didn't know how else to protect yourself. And now that you see it, you get to choose. You can keep operating from this pattern, refined and sophisticated and unconscious. Or you can dismantle it, grieve it, thank it for how it kept you safe, and then build something new, something clean, something whole. The choice is yours, but choose consciously, because unconsciousness is no longer available to you. You can't unknow what you now know. You can only decide what you're going to do with that knowledge. Welcome to the real work. This is where heroes are forged, not in the light of easy virtue, but in the fire of confronting your own darkness and choosing transformation anyway. We need to talk about your body, and I know that sentence alone probably made you uncomfortable, because if there's one thing INFJs are consistently terrible at, it's inhabiting physical reality. You live in your head, in your intuitions, in meaning and metaphor and future projections. Meanwhile, your actual body, the flesh and blood organism that carries your consciousness through the world, is often treated like an inconvenient vehicle you're forced to maintain while doing the real work of psychological and spiritual exploration. This isn't a character flaw. It's a structural feature of your cognitive wiring. In Jung's function stack, INFJs have extroverted sensing, SE, as their inferior function. This is your weakest, least developed cognitive process, and SE is precisely the function responsible for present-moment physical awareness, for sensory engagement with concrete reality, for being here, now, in this body, in this moment. Jung wrote extensively about the inferior function. He called it the Achilles heel of the personality, the doorway through which the unconscious storms in when you're under stress, when you're unbalanced, when you've pushed too far into your dominant functions without grounding in the others. And for INFJs specifically, the inferior SE manifests in some very particular, very problematic patterns. Let me tell you about Jennifer. She was a therapist, deeply intuitive, psychologically sophisticated, spent her days helping clients navigate complex emotional terrain. She was exceptional at her work, could read subtext, could track unconscious patterns, could see connections others missed. She lived almost entirely in the realm of meaning, and then one day she collapsed, literally collapsed in her office between sessions, rushed to the hospital. The diagnosis: severe adrenal fatigue, dangerous vitamin deficiencies, stress-induced autoimmune flare-up. Her body had been screaming at her for months. She had ignored every signal. The fatigue she pushed through with more coffee. The digestive issues she dismissed as stress. The chronic pain she normalized as just part of life. She had been so focused on the psychological and spiritual dimensions of existence that she'd completely neglected the physical vessel that made that existence possible. This is inferior C in crisis. This is what happens when you live so completely in intuition and meaning that you lose connection to the basic requirements of physical embodiment. And it's epidemic among INFJs. Not just neglect of physical health, but active dissociation from the body. Treating your soma like it's separate from your psyche, like it's a problem to be solved rather than an integral part of who you are. Jung understood this split viscerally. He talked about modern humans' disconnection from instinct, from the body's wisdom, from what he called the 2-million-year-old man within us, the ancient instinctual self that knows how to survive, how to rest, how to replenish, how to exist in balance with physical reality. For INFJs, this disconnection manifests in predictable ways. You forget to eat until you're lightheaded. You ignore sleep because your mind is too active. You push through exhaustion because there's always one more insight to chase, one more pattern to understand, one more person to help. You treat your body's needs as interruptions to your real work rather than as fundamental to your capacity to do any work at all. And then there's the other pattern, the C-grip experience. This is what happens when your inferior function, neglected and underdeveloped, suddenly takes over in moments of extreme stress. For INFJs, SE grip looks like impulsive sensory indulgence, binge eating, compulsive shopping, substance abuse, reckless sexual behavior. Suddenly you flip from being completely disconnected from physical pleasure to being consumed by it. From ascetic neglect to hedonistic excess. No middle ground, no integration. Just the pendulum swinging wildly from one extreme to the other. Jung described the inferior function as the doorway to the unconscious. When it erupts, it brings with it all the shadow material you've been avoiding. For INFJs in C-grip, that material often relates to repressed bodily desires, unmet physical needs, the rage at having to exist in a body at all when you'd rather just be pure consciousness. I've experienced this personally. There have been periods in my life where I was so disconnected from my body that I would work 16-hour days, sleep 4 hours, eat one meal, and tell myself I was fine because my mind was still sharp. And then, inevitably, the crash would come. And when it came, I wouldn't gently ease back into balance. I would flip into the opposite extreme. I would binge on food, on media, on anything that provided immediate sensory gratification. I would go from ignoring my body completely to being controlled by bodily impulses completely. This is not integration. This is the inferior function taking revenge for years of neglect. And the way out isn't to white-knuckle your way back to control. It's to develop a conscious, sustained relationship with the physical dimension of existence. Jung called this the integration of the inferior function. And for INFJs, it's some of the most difficult psychological work you'll do because it requires you to value something you're naturally not good at. It requires you to spend energy developing a capacity that doesn't come naturally when you could be spending that energy on what you do naturally, which is live in intuition and meaning. But here's the truth Jung would tell you. You cannot individuate, cannot become psychologically whole while remaining trapped in your dominant functions. Wholeness requires integrating all of the psyche, including the parts that are uncomfortable, underdeveloped, and undervalued. Your body is not optional. Present moment awareness is not a luxury. Physical self-care is not shallow or unspiritual. These are fundamental requirements for sustainable consciousness. So, what does SE integration actually look like practically? Let me give you a framework. Grounding protocols for those of us who live dangerously far from embodied reality. Protocol 1. Sensory anchoring. This is the practice of deliberately engaging your senses throughout the day, not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. Taste your food slowly. Actually notice the flavors instead of eating while reading or working. Feel the temperature of water on your skin in the shower. Notice the texture of fabric against your body. Listen to sounds in your environment without immediately interpreting them. This sounds absurdly simple, but for INFJs, it's revolutionary. You're training yourself to be present with physical sensation without immediately abstracting it into meaning. Protocol 2. Body scanning. Twice a day, morning and evening, do a 60-second body scan. Close your eyes and move attention through your physical form. Tension in the shoulders, tightness in the jaw, heaviness in the stomach. Don't interpret these sensations. Don't fix them, just notice them. You're developing the habit of checking in with your body's actual state rather than assuming you know how it feels based on your mental narrative about how you should feel. Protocol 3. Movement for presence. Exercise is important, yes, but I'm talking about something more specific. Find a form of movement that requires enough focus that you can't be in your head while doing it. Rock climbing, dancing, martial arts, yoga done with attention rather than as background activity. The goal isn't fitness, the goal is enforced presence. You're using physical challenge to pull consciousness out of abstract thinking and into immediate embodied experience. Protocol 4. Pleasure without purpose. This is the hardest one. Do something physical that feels good for no reason other than it feels good. Take a bath not because you need to relax for productivity, but just because warm water feels pleasant. Get a massage not to fix a problem, but to experience touch. Eat something delicious not as fuel, but as sensory enjoyment. You're learning that physical pleasure is valid in itself, not just as a means to psychological or spiritual ends. Protocol 5. Sleep sovereignty. This is non-negotiable. Your body needs rest, and no amount of intuitive insight will substitute for actual sleep. Jung himself was emphatic about this. He believed dream work was essential to psychological health, and dreams require sleep. Set a sleep schedule, protect it, treat it as sacred, because when you're sleep deprived, every other function degrades. Your intuition becomes unreliable, your empathy becomes overwhelming, your thinking becomes fuzzy. Sleep is not wasted time. It's when your psyche processes, integrates, and restores itself. Now, here's the deeper integration challenge. It's not enough to just develop C skills. You need to fundamentally shift your relationship to physicality itself. You need to stop treating your body as the enemy of your spiritual development and recognize it as the vehicle for it. Jung was explicit about this in his later work. He rejected the Gnostic split between spirit and matter, between soul and body. He argued that individuation requires the integration of opposites, and one of the fundamental opposites is psyche and soma, mind and body. You cannot become whole by transcending the body. You become whole by uniting consciousness with embodiment. This is the paradox INFJs must hold. Your greatest gifts are psychological and intuitive, and you are an animal that needs food, rest, movement, and sensory engagement to survive. Both are true. Neither cancels the other out. And the goal isn't to balance them in some perfect 50-50 split. The goal is to honor both dimensions of existence consciously, rather than unconsciously privileging one while neglecting the other. There's also a collective dimension to this that we need to address. Modern culture, especially intellectual and spiritual subcultures, has inherited a deep contempt for the body. We valorize the life of the mind. We treat physical needs as base, as lower, as something to transcend. This is not Jung's vision. This is Platonic dualism, and Jung explicitly rejected it. When you neglect your body because you've internalized the belief that physical existence is less valuable than psychological or spiritual existence, you're not being advanced. You're being colonized by unconscious cultural prejudices. You're repeating the same split that has caused immense suffering throughout human history. The integrated INFJ recognizes that consciousness arises from the body, not despite it. Your intuitions are biological processes. Your empathy is rooted in mirror neurons and nervous system attunement. Your mystical experiences are neurochemical events. None of this reduces their value. It situates them properly. You are not a ghost in a machine. You are an embodied consciousness. An embodiment is not an obstacle to transcendence. It's the foundation for it. Jung said, "The body is the visibility of the soul." Your physical health is not separate from your psychological health. When you ignore physical symptoms, you're ignoring messages from the unconscious. When you override bodily limits, you're creating shadow material that will eventually erupt in more destructive ways. Jennifer, the therapist I mentioned earlier, eventually recovered from her health crisis, but recovery required a complete restructuring of her relationship to her body. She had to stop treating physical care as shallow, had to recognize that her capacity to do deep psychological work depended entirely on having a nervous system that wasn't in constant crisis, had to learn that being embodied wasn't a concession to weakness. It was a requirement for sustainable strength. She told me something that stuck with me. I spent years thinking that being spiritual meant transcending the body, and then my body nearly died trying to get my attention. Now, I understand that being spiritual means being present to all of reality, including the reality that I'm an animal with animal needs, and honoring those needs isn't shallow, it's sacred. This is the wisdom of integrated C, not hedonistic indulgence, not ascetic denial, but conscious, reverent engagement with physical existence as a dimension of the sacred. Your body is not your enemy. It's not holding you back from enlightenment. It's the instrument through which enlightenment becomes possible. So here's the practice I want you to commit to right now. For the next 7 days, set an alarm for 3 times during the day. When it goes off, stop whatever you're doing and ask your body, what do you need right now? And then, this is crucial, actually listen, actually respond. If it says it's thirsty, drink water. If it says it's tired, rest. If it says it needs to move, move. Don't interpret, don't negotiate, don't override. Just listen and respond. This will feel strange. It will feel indulgent. It will feel like you're being controlled by base needs. But really, you're learning partnership. You're learning that you and your body are not adversaries. You're learning that consciousness requires a stable biological foundation. The goal isn't to become obsessed with physicality. It's not to flip from neglect to narcissistic preoccupation with your body. The goal is integration. The goal is what Jung called the union of opposites. In this case, uniting your intuitive, meaning-seeking consciousness with your physical, sensory-engaged embodiment. And here's what happens when you do this work consistently. Your intuition actually becomes more reliable because it's grounded in a nervous system that isn't chronically dysregulated. Your empathy becomes more sustainable because you're not absorbing everyone's emotional content into a depleted physical system. Your capacity for consciousness expands because consciousness requires energy, and energy requires a body that's nourished, rested, and cared for. This is the paradox that INFJs need to embrace. Taking care of your body isn't a distraction from your spiritual work. It is your spiritual work. The body is not something to transcend. It's something to inhabit fully, and full inhabitation requires attention, care, respect, and presence. Jung spent the final decades of his life emphasizing this point. He built the Bullingen Tower, his stone retreat, with his own hands. He worked with stone, wood, fire, engaged in physical labor as a form of psychological integration. He understood that the intellectual and intuitive work he did required balance with embodied sensory engagement. He understood that wholeness couldn't be achieved through consciousness alone. So, as we move forward in this journey, I need you to make a commitment. Not just an intellectual commitment, but an embodied one. Your body is not optional. Your physical needs are not interruptions. Your sensory experience is not less valuable than your intuitive insights. You are not a consciousness trapped in a meat prison. You are a unified psychosomatic organism, and honoring all dimensions of that organism is not shallow. It's the foundation of genuine psychological wholeness. The inferior function is called inferior not because it's less important, but because it's less developed. And the work of individuation includes developing what's been neglected. For you, that means learning to live in your body as fully as you live in your intuitions. Learning to be present to physical reality as attentively as you're present to psychological reality. Learning that the mystical and the mundane are not opposites. They're dimensions of the same unified existence. This is hard work. It's work that goes against your natural grain. But it's also the work that will save you from the burnout, the health crises, the sea-grip episodes that make you feel like you're not in control of your own impulses. Integration of the inferior function is the difference between being a brilliant mind attached to a neglected body and being a whole person, consciousness and soma united in service of your individuation. Take it seriously. Your life depends on it, literally. There's a phenomenon that INFJs have become almost infamous for in personality-type communities. It's been romanticized, pathologized, defended, and criticized in equal measure. We call it the door slam, the sudden, total, and seemingly permanent severance of a relationship. No warning, no final confrontation, no gradual fade, just complete amputation. One day the person is in your life, and the next day they're gone. Blocked, deleted, erased from your emotional landscape as if they never existed. And if you're an INFJ, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You've done it, maybe once, maybe multiple times, and you've carried guilt about it, confusion about it, defensiveness about it, because the world tells you that cutting people off without explanation is cruel, cold, immature, that healthy people communicate, work through conflict, give people chances. But Carl Jung would have a very different analysis. He wouldn't necessarily condone the door slam, but he would understand it. Because from a Jungian perspective, the door slam isn't just relationship dysfunction, it's a failed individuation process. It's what happens when you can't maintain your psychological boundaries while remaining in connection. It's the psyche's nuclear option when all other defense mechanisms have been exhausted. Jung wrote, The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But what happens when the reaction is toxic? When one substance is being dissolved rather than transformed? When the alchemical process isn't creating gold, but producing poison? Let me tell you about Rachel. She spent 3 years in a relationship with someone who was, by any objective measure, psychologically abusive. Gaslighting, manipulation, intermittent reinforcement, emotional volatility. But Rachel, with her INFJ wiring, kept believing she could understand him into wholeness. She kept using her I to see his potential, his wounded inner child, the reasons behind his behavior. She kept using her Fae to manage his emotions, to keep the peace, to make the relationship work through sheer force of empathy. And for 3 years, she disappeared. Her friends watched it happen. They tried to intervene. But Rachel couldn't see it because she was inside it. Her dominant I had locked onto the pattern of who he could become, and her auxiliary Fae was working overtime to create the conditions for that transformation. She wasn't seeing who he actually was. She was seeing the archetypal pattern she'd projected onto him. And then one day, something shifted. She can't even tell you what the final straw was. There wasn't a dramatic incident, no climactic betrayal worse than all the previous ones. Just a sudden, absolute knowing, I have to leave. And more than that, I have to cut all contact forever. Within 24 hours, she had moved out, blocked him on every platform, told mutual friends not to pass messages, and effectively erased him from her existence. The door slam, complete and total. Her friends were relieved, but also disturbed. "Why didn't you just have a final conversation?" they asked. "Why didn't you tell him why you were leaving?" And Rachel couldn't explain it to them, because the truth was, she didn't trust herself to have that conversation. She knew that if she engaged with him one more time, his manipulation would work. Her Fae would activate. She'd start managing his emotions, making his comfort her responsibility. Her knee would start seeing potential again, convincing her that this time would be different. The only way to escape was complete severance. The door slam wasn't cruelty, it was survival. This is what Jung called the psyche's self-protective function. When conscious boundaries have failed repeatedly, the unconscious implements a boundary so absolute that it cannot be negotiated. It's the psychological equivalent of an immune system attacking an infection so aggressively that it risks harming the host in the process. Effective, yes, but also a sign that the system is in crisis. Because here's what the door slam actually reveals. You've been failing to individuate within the relationship. You've been losing yourself, dissolving your boundaries, sacrificing your needs so completely that the only way to reclaim yourself is to physically remove the other person from your reality. You can't find yourself while remaining connected to them because you've collapsed your sense of self into the relationship so thoroughly that separation isn't possible. Only amputation. Jung's process of individuation specifically includes learning to maintain psychological sovereignty while in relationship. This is one of the most difficult tasks of human development, remaining yourself while intimately connected to another. For INFJs, this is especially challenging because your Fae wants harmony, wants connection, wants to merge emotional fields, and your knee reads people so deeply that you start living in their potential rather than their actuality. The door slam is what happens when you've violated your own boundaries so egregiously for so long that your psyche has to take drastic action. It's not a sign of strength, it's a sign that you waited far too long to implement conscious boundaries. It's the unconscious forcing what the conscious self refused to do. Now, there's another dimension to this that's crucial to understand. INFJs door slam not just because boundaries were violated, but because of the specific nature of INFJ boundary erosion. You don't just let people treat you badly, you actively understand why they're treating you badly. Your I creates elaborate psychological explanations for their behavior. Your Fey makes their emotional state your responsibility. You don't just tolerate abuse, you empathetically contextualize it until it doesn't feel like abuse anymore. This is the shadow side of empathy. You understand people so well that you excuse behavior that should be inexcusable. You see their wounds so clearly that you allow them to wound you. You're so focused on their individuation process that you neglect your own. And then, when you finally door slam, you're not just cutting off a person, you're cutting off your own pattern of self-abandonment. You're rejecting not just them, but the version of yourself that enabled the dynamic. This is why door slams feel so absolute. You're not just saying, I don't want you in my life. You're saying, I refuse to be the person I became in relationship with you. Jung would recognize this as a necessary but crude form of shadow work. You're recognizing that the relationship brought out shadow aspects in you, the people pleaser, the martyr, the savior, and you're severing the relationship to sever those patterns. But the problem is, cutting off the person doesn't automatically integrate the shadow. It just removes the mirror. The patterns remain inside you, ready to activate with the next person who triggers them. The more conscious approach, the approach Jung would advocate, is to establish boundaries before you need to door slam. This means learning to say no to emotional labor you don't have capacity for, even if it creates temporary discomfort. Confronting manipulation and boundary violations directly instead of empathetically understanding them into acceptability. Recognizing when you're projecting potential onto someone instead of responding to who they actually are. Leaving relationships consciously with communication before your psyche has to force ejection. This is vastly more difficult than door slamming because it requires staying conscious during the relationship instead of waking up afterward. It requires using your ni and fi in service of your own well-being, not just in service of understanding and accommodating others. Let me share my own door slam pattern. I've done it 3 times in my life, 3 complete relationship ejections where I went from intimately connected to total stranger overnight. And in all 3 cases, when I looked back honestly, I saw the same pattern. I had seen red flags early, explained them away with psychological sophistication, sacrificed my boundaries repeatedly while telling myself I was being mature and understanding, and then suddenly reached a breaking point where continuation felt like psychological death. The door slam saved me each time, but it also revealed my failure to honor my own perceptions, my failure to implement boundaries when they were needed, my failure to individuate within the relationship instead of dissolving into it. The guilt I carried wasn't just about cutting people off, it was about recognizing how long I'd betrayed myself before I finally acted. The door slam wasn't the problem, it was the emergency solution to a problem I'd been ignoring. Jung's concept of individuation in relationship means learning to be yourself fully while allowing others to be themselves fully. This creates inevitable conflict because full selfhood includes needs, preferences, limits that won't always align with another person's needs, preferences, and limits. And for INFJs, conflict feels dangerous. Your Fey abhors disharmony. Your Ni can see how conflict might lead to relationship loss, so you preemptively sacrifice yourself to avoid conflict. You manage everyone's comfort except your own. And this is where the door slam pattern originates, in the refusal to have difficult conversations when they're small and manageable, in the accumulation of unspoken resentments, in the gradual erosion of self through 1,000 tiny accommodations, each one seeming insignificant but collectively creating complete self-abandonment. The alternative, conscious boundary setting, requires you to tolerate several uncomfortable truths. Some people will not like you when you have boundaries. They preferred the version of you that had none. Some relationships cannot survive your individuation. They were built on your self-abandonment, and your wholeness makes them obsolete. Conflict is not always solvable through understanding and empathy. Sometimes people simply want incompatible things. You cannot save people who don't want to save themselves, and your empathy doesn't give you the right to try. These truths are devastating to the INFJ psyche. They violate your core belief that enough understanding, enough compassion, enough patience can redeem any situation. But Jung was clear. Some things cannot be redeemed. Some relationships cannot be salvaged. And recognizing this isn't failure, it's wisdom. The door slam will always be available to you as an emergency exit, but the goal of individuation is to make it unnecessary. To develop such clear, consistent boundaries that relationships either naturally align with your well-being or naturally end before you need nuclear options. This means practicing what I call conscious boundary setting as individuation practice. Name your limits explicitly, even when it's uncomfortable. I need 3 days of alone time per week. I won't discuss this topic anymore. I'm not available for emotional support after 9 p.m. Address violations immediately and directly. When you criticize me in front of others, I feel disrespected. I need you to bring concerns directly to me, not understanding why they do it, not managing their reaction to your boundary, just stating the limit. Follow through with consequences. If the violation continues, you reduce contact. If it continues further, you end the relationship, consciously. With communication, before you need the door slam, distinguish between enforcing boundaries and punishing others. Boundaries are about protecting your well-being, not about making others suffer for violating your limits. Accept that some people will choose not to respect your boundaries. This is information about them, not evidence that you're asking for too much. This is profoundly difficult work because it requires you to value your own well-being as much as you value others. It requires you to act on your perceptions, even when others disagree with them. It requires you to trust yourself more than you trust others' interpretations of you. Jung called this the development of the self, capital S, as distinct from the ego and separate from collective values. Yourself knows your limits. Yourself knows when relationships are toxic. Yourself sends you signals through your body, your intuition, your dreams. But your ego, contaminated by Phi's need for harmony and Ni's projection of potential, overrides those signals. Until your psyche forces the issue through a door slam, there's one more layer here that needs addressing. Some INFJs become addicted to the door slam. They start to identify with it. I'm the person who cuts people off. I don't tolerate disrespect. When I'm done, I'm done. This becomes a source of pride, even power. And this is the shadow emerging again. Because the door slam as identity is still relationship dysfunction. It's just dysfunction in the opposite direction. Instead of never having boundaries, you have only absolute boundaries. Instead of tolerating everything, you tolerate nothing. Instead of giving infinite chances, you give none. This isn't integration, it's just a different form of imbalance. The individuated INFJ has boundaries that are firm but not rigid, can end relationships when necessary but doesn't need to make it dramatic, can forgive some violations while refusing to tolerate others, has nuance, has discernment, doesn't need the door slam because they're handling relationship dynamics consciously as they arise. So here's the reflection question I need you to sit with. Have you ever door slammed someone not because the relationship was irredeemable, but because you were avoiding the discomfort of having a difficult conversation? Have you ever cut someone off because it was easier than doing the hard work of establishing and maintaining boundaries while remaining in relationship? If the answer is yes, and for most INFJs it is, then you have individuation work to do. Not to make yourself feel guilty, but to recognize where you're still operating unconsciously, where you're still letting your psyche make decisions that your conscious self should be making. The door slam is a tool. Sometimes it's the right tool. But if it's the only tool you have for handling relationship difficulties, then you're not as developed as you think you are. You're just sophisticated in a different form of avoidance. Jung's vision of psychological maturity includes the capacity to stay present with difficulty, to remain conscious in conflict, to maintain your boundaries without ejecting people who challenge them, to engage authentically even when it's uncomfortable. This is the alchemical work, transforming relationship from something that consumes you into something that refines you. And this is only possible when you value your own individuation as much as you've been valuing everyone else's, when you recognize that your wholeness is not negotiable, when you understand that true empathy includes empathy for yourself. When you finally claim the truth Jung spent his entire career trying to get people to see, you cannot save others by losing yourself. You can only serve others by finding yourself. And finding yourself requires boundaries, especially when maintaining those boundaries means losing relationships that depended on your self-abandonment. Comment below, boundaries if you're ready to stop door slam as your only boundary enforcement mechanism, if you're ready to learn the harder work of staying conscious in relationship instead of ejecting from it. Not because door slams are always wrong, but because they shouldn't be your only option. The goal is consciousness, always consciousness, in relationship and out of it. And consciousness requires you to be present for the full process, the difficult conversations, the boundary violations, the confrontations, the potential loss, not just the dramatic exit. This is the path of the individuated INFJ, not the person who's so empathetic they tolerate everything, and not the person who's so boundaried they tolerate nothing, but the person who can discern what deserves tolerance and what demands limits, who can stay present with complexity without collapsing into either extreme. That's the work. That's the alchemy. That's what transforms relationship from your weakness into your strength. Now we enter territory that will sound like mysticism to the skeptical mind. But Carl Jung wasn't being mystical when he proposed the collective unconscious. He was being empirically observant. He noticed through decades of clinical work that his patients kept producing symbols, images, and narratives they couldn't have encountered in their personal experience. Symbols from ancient mythologies they'd never studied. Archetypal patterns that appeared across cultures and centuries. Dream content that seemed to access something deeper and older than individual psychology. And his conclusion was radical. Beneath the personal unconscious, your individual repressed memories, complexes, and shadow material, lies a deeper layer, a collective unconscious shared by all humanity, a reservoir of primordial images, archetypal patterns, and instinctual knowledge accumulated over millennia of human evolution. This wasn't metaphysics. It was Jung's attempt to explain observable psychological phenomena. And if you're an INFJ, you've accessed this layer whether you realize it or not. Because your dominant introverted intuition doesn't just read individual psychology, it reads the archetypal patterns underneath. You're not just perceiving what someone is hiding, you're perceiving what archetype they're embodying, what primordial drama they're unconsciously enacting. Let me tell you about Thomas. He was an INFJ working as a university professor, teaching literature, and he noticed something strange. Strangers would approach him in coffee shops, in airports, in random public spaces, and within minutes they'd be telling him things they'd never told anyone. Childhood trauma, marital infidelity, suicidal ideation, the deepest, darkest content of their psyches, unprompted, with someone they'd met 3 minutes ago. At first, Thomas thought this was just his empathetic presence, his fae making people feel safe. But as he studied Jung, he realized something more complex was happening. He wasn't just being empathetic, he was unconsciously embodying an archetype. The wounded healer, the wise old man, the confessor. And people were responding not to Thomas the individual, but to the archetypal energy he was channeling. This is what Jung meant when he talked about archetypal possession. It's not supernatural, it's psychological. Certain individuals, often without conscious awareness, begin to embody archetypal patterns so strongly that others unconsciously recognize and respond to those patterns. INFJs do this constantly. You become the healer, the prophet, the mystic, the revolutionary, the counselor. Not because you choose these roles consciously, but because something in your psychological structure makes you a natural vessel for these energies. Jung wrote extensively about the dangers of this phenomenon. He called it inflation, when the ego identifies with an archetype and believes it is the archetype, rather than simply channeling it temporarily. When Thomas started to believe he was the wise counselor, rather than someone temporarily serving that function, he began making mistakes. He started giving advice he wasn't qualified to give. He took responsibility for outcomes he couldn't control. He confused his personal wisdom with the archetypal wisdom flowing through him. This is the trap for INFJs specifically. Because you have such natural access to archetypal layers, you start to identify with archetypal roles. You believe you're the healer, the empath, the seer. And the moment you make that identification, you've stopped serving the archetype and started using it to inflate your ego. You've crossed from being a channel for collective energies into believing you are special, chosen, fundamentally different from ordinary humans. Jung was merciless in his criticism of this pattern. He saw it repeatedly in his patients, people who had genuine access to the collective unconscious, but who then inflated themselves with that access, becoming grandiose, messianic, convinced of their unique importance. And he insisted that the antidote was always the same: humility, the recognition that archetypal energies flow through you, but are not you, that you're a temporary vessel, not the source. Now, let's get specific about how this manifests for INFJs. There are particular archetypes that INFJs tend to embody, often unconsciously. The wounded healer. You've been hurt deeply, and that wound has become a source of compassion and insight for helping others heal. But the shadow is using others' wounds to avoid healing your own, staying in the wound because it's become your identity. The prophet. You see what's coming before others do. You perceive patterns and trajectories invisible to conventional awareness. But the shadow is becoming attached to being right, to predicting disaster, to the specialness of being the one who sees. The mystic. You have access to experiences and perceptions that feel transcendent, numinous, beyond ordinary reality. But the shadow is spiritual bypassing, using transcendence to avoid embodiment, using cosmic consciousness to escape human responsibility. The revolutionary. You see through cultural conditioning, question every authority, reject consensus reality. But the shadow is chronic outsiderness, inability to belong anywhere, contrarian identity that defines itself through opposition. The counselor. People naturally seek your guidance, your perspective, your emotional support. But the shadow is becoming the relationship expert who can't maintain relationships, the therapist with no therapy, the guide who's lost. Each of these archetypes carries genuine power. Each offers real value to the collective. But each also carries the temptation of identification, of inflation, of using the archetype's power to feed the ego's need for specialness. Thomas eventually had to do brutal shadow work around his counselor archetype. He had to admit that he loved it when strangers confessed to him. that it made him feel important, special, chosen, that he had become addicted to being the person people turned to in crisis. Not because he genuinely wanted to help, though that was part of it, but because being needed filled a void in his own psyche. His childhood had been one of invisibility, of being overlooked, and the counselor archetype gave him the visibility he'd always craved. This recognition was devastating, but it was also liberating, because once he saw the pattern, he could choose differently. He could serve the counselor archetype when genuinely called to, and decline it when he was being driven by ego need. He could help people from a place of conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. This is what Jung called the differentiation between ego and archetype. It requires you to recognize, this energy flowing through me is not me. I am temporarily serving this function, but it's not my identity. And when this function is no longer needed, I can put it down and return to being simply myself. But who is simply yourself when you've been channeling archetypal energy your entire life? This is the existential question INFJs must eventually confront. If you strip away all the roles, all the archetypal identifications, all the functions you perform for others, who are you? What remains? For many INFJs, this question produces crisis because you've organized your entire identity around being the vessel for these energies. Without them, you feel empty, purposeless. Without them, you're not special anymore. You're just another human struggling with the same mundane challenges as everyone else. And this is precisely the point where genuine individuation begins, because you can't individuate, can't become your authentic self, while identified with collective archetypes. The archetypes are, by definition, collective. They're transpersonal. They belong to humanity, not to you specifically. Your authentic self is underneath the archetypal layers. It's the individual soul that exists before it takes on collective roles. Jung described this process as withdrawing projections from the collective unconscious. You have to recognize that the healer energy isn't you, it's an energy you sometimes channel. The prophet isn't you, it's a function you sometimes serve. The mystic isn't you, it's an experience you sometimes have. And underneath all of these, there's a person, a specific, individual, embodied consciousness with preferences, quirks, needs, limitations that have nothing to do with archetypal grandeur. This person, your actual self, is probably much more ordinary than the archetypal version. And that ordinariness is exactly what your ego finds so threatening, because ordinary doesn't feel special. Ordinary doesn't feel chosen. Ordinary doesn't compensate for your childhood wounds or validate your sense that you're fundamentally different. But Jung would tell you, ordinary is where real life happens. Archetypal identification is a defense against the difficulty of being human. It's easier to be the wounded healer serving humanity than to be a regular person with unprocessed trauma, working on your own healing. It's easier to be the prophet warning about collective doom than to be someone building a sustainable life in present reality. It's easier to be the mystic accessing cosmic consciousness than to be someone doing the mundane work of relationships, embodiment, and psychological integration. Let me tell you about an INFJ artist named Claire. She produced work that seemed to channel something beyond herself. Paintings and poetry that captured collective grief, collective longing, collective transformation. People would look at her art and weep, recognizing something in it they couldn't name but desperately needed to see. And Claire believed she was special, that she had been chosen to be a vessel for the collective unconscious, that her suffering, and she had suffered immensely, was purposeful, even noble, because it gave her access to these depths. And then she had a breakdown, a complete psychological collapse where the archetypal energies she'd been channeling overwhelmed her completely. She couldn't tell where she ended and the collective unconscious began. She was drowning in symbols, flooded with visions, possessed by energies too large for her individual psyche to contain. She ended up hospitalized, diagnosed with a psychotic episode, medicated back to baseline reality, and in recovery, working with a Jungian analyst, she had to face a brutal truth. She had been using archetypal identification to avoid her own individuation. She had convinced herself that channeling collective pain meant she didn't have to process her personal pain, that serving as a vessel for transformation meant she didn't have to transform herself, that being an artist of the collective unconscious exempted her from the ordinary work of building a life. The recovery process required her to establish boundaries with the collective unconscious, to recognize that she was an individual person first and a channel for archetypal energy second, to develop what Jung called ego strength, a stable sense of individual identity that could interact with archetypal material without being consumed by it. This is the integration work for INFJs, who are natural channels for collective energy. You have to develop a strong enough ego, not in the sense of narcissism, but in the sense of individual psychological structure, that you can dip into the collective unconscious and return. You can serve archetypal functions without becoming possessed by them. You can access transpersonal realms without losing your personal identity. Jung used the metaphor of the psyche as a house. The ego is the ground floor where you live your daily life. The personal unconscious is the basement where your individual repressed material lives. And the collective unconscious is the sub-basement that connects your house to every other house, the shared foundation of humanity. You can visit the sub-basement, you can access what's there, but you can't live there. You have to be able to return to the ground floor, to your individual life, to the mundane tasks of existence. For INFJs, the danger is spending so much time in the sub-basement that you forget how to function on the ground floor. You become so attuned to collective patterns that you can't handle individual relationships, so connected to archetypal material that you're disconnected from your actual life. So identified with transpersonal meaning that personal meaning becomes inaccessible. I've experienced this myself. There was a period where I was so immersed in Jungian psychology, so focused on archetypal patterns and collective transformation, that I neglected every practical aspect of my life. My finances were a disaster. My relationships were suffering. My health was declining. But I told myself it was all worth it because I was doing the work, capital T, capital W, the deep psychological and spiritual work of transformation. And then someone I respected looked at me and said, "You're using Jung as a way to avoid Jung's actual message, which is that you have to live your individual life. You have to incarnate. You have to be here, in this body, in this time, dealing with these actual circumstances. You can't bypass embodiment by focusing on archetypes." That was the mirror I needed, because they were right. I had been using my access to the collective unconscious as a spiritual bypass, a way to feel important and connected while avoiding the difficulty of my actual existence. I had inflated myself with archetypal identification to avoid facing the ordinariness and struggle of my personal reality. The integration required me to put the archetypes down, to stop channeling, to stop being a vessel, to just be a person for a while, and that felt like death, because without the archetypal roles, I didn't know who I was. I had been the mystic, the guide, the one who saw patterns, and when I released those identifications, I was left with just me, a regular person with regular problems, no special access, no cosmic purpose, just a human trying to figure out how to live. And slowly, gradually, I discovered that this ordinariness was actually the foundation I'd been missing, that I couldn't sustainably channel archetypal energy without first having a stable individual identity to return to. That the ground floor of the psyche needed to be solid before I could safely access the basement and sub-basement. This is what Jung meant by individuation preceding transcendence. You have to become an individual, a whole, integrated, embodied person before you can safely transcend into transpersonal realms. If you try to transcend before you've individuated, you're not transcending, you're dissociating. You're using cosmic consciousness to escape human consciousness. You're using the collective unconscious to avoid the personal unconscious. So here's the framework for conscious relationship with archetypal energy, what I call serving archetypes, without being consumed by them. First, recognize when you're channeling. Notice the shift in your energy. When you slip into an archetypal role, the healer, the prophet, the counselor, there's a feeling of expansion, of accessing something larger than your individual self. This is real. You are accessing something larger, but you need to be conscious of it happening. Second, name it explicitly. I'm serving the healer archetype right now. This feels like prophet energy. I've slipped into counselor mode. By naming it, you create distance. You differentiate between you and the archetype. You're serving it, not being it. Third, set time limits. You can consciously decide, I will serve this function for the next hour. I will hold space for this energy during this conversation. And then, when the time is up, you consciously release it. You return to your individual self. This is a practice. It requires intention. Fourth, check your motivation. Are you serving this archetype because it's genuinely needed in this moment? Or are you doing it because being in the archetypal role makes you feel special, important, powerful? This requires brutal honesty, because the ego is subtle. It will convince you that your service is pure when really you're feeding on the energy of being needed. Fifth, return to the ordinary. After channeling archetypal energy, deliberately engage in mundane activities. Wash dishes, pay bills, have a normal conversation about nothing important. This grounds you back in individual reality. It reminds you that you're a person, not just a vessel. Sixth, develop ego strength. This means therapy, shadow work, integration of personal unconscious material. The stronger your individual identity, the more safely you can access collective realms without being consumed. It's like developing a strong immune system before exposing yourself to pathogens. Jung was explicit about this. The collective unconscious is powerful and dangerous. It contains healing potential, yes, but it also contains destructive potential. Archetypal energies are not inherently benevolent. They're primordial forces that can heal or destroy, depending on how they're engaged. And the determining factor is the strength and consciousness of the individual ego engaging with them. Weak ego plus archetypal access, possession, inflation, psychosis. Strong ego plus archetypal access, genuine service, creative expression, transformative power. The goal isn't to avoid archetypal material. For INFJs, that's impossible and undesirable. You have natural access to these layers. That's your gift. The goal is to access them consciously, with boundaries, from a foundation of individual stability. There's also a collective dimension here that's crucial to understand. When you channel archetypal energy consciously, you're performing a service for the collective. You're making visible something that needs to be seen. You're embodying an energy that's needed in this moment. This is why people respond to you so strongly. They're recognizing something in you that speaks to something in them. But when you channel unconsciously, when you're possessed by the archetype rather than serving it, you become a problem for the collective. You become the guru who abuses followers, the healer who creates dependency, the prophet who incites harmful action, the mystic who leads people into dissociation rather than integration. The difference is consciousness, always consciousness. Are you aware that you're serving a function larger than yourself? Are you maintaining boundaries so you don't become consumed? Are you checking your motivations? Are you remaining grounded in your individual humanity, even while channeling transpersonal energy? Claire, the artist who had the breakdown, eventually returned to her work, but she approached it differently. She no longer believed she was the artist of the collective unconscious. She understood she was an artist who sometimes accessed collective material. She set boundaries with the work, specific hours, specific practices, specific rituals for entering and exiting the creative space. She built a normal life, relationships, routines, mundane pleasures that anchored her in individual reality, and her art actually became more powerful because it came from a grounded place. It wasn't psychotic flooding, it was conscious translation. She could access the depths and return with something coherent, something that could actually help others rather than overwhelming them. This is the mature INFJ relationship with the collective unconscious. You're a translator, a bridge, a vessel when needed, but not a permanent resident of transpersonal realms. You visit, you serve, you return. You honor both dimensions, the collective and the individual, the archetypal and the personal, the transcendent and the mundane. Jung spent his entire career trying to model this balance. Yes, he explored the collective unconscious extensively. Yes, he accessed archetypal material in his own psyche, but he also built a house with his own hands, maintained a medical practice, raised a family, lived an embodied individual life. He didn't choose between transcendence and immanence. He integrated both. And this is the invitation for you, not to stop accessing the depths, not to suppress your natural ability to channel archetypal energy, but to do it consciously, to serve it without being consumed by it, to recognize it as a function you perform, not an identity you are. Because underneath all the archetypal roles, underneath all the collective energies, there's you, the individual soul, the specific person with your particular history, your unique constellation of wounds and gifts, your personal path of individuation. And that person, that ordinary, limited, embodied person, is what Jung believed was most precious, not the archetypal roles you play, not the collective energies you channel, but the individual you are. Comment below, grounded, if you're ready to stop using archetypal identification to avoid the difficulty of being an ordinary human. If you're ready to serve collective energies without being consumed by them. If you're ready to honor both dimensions, the transpersonal and the personal, instead of using one to escape the other. This is the work. This is what transforms you from a vessel that gets emptied and broken to a channel that remains whole while serving. This is what allows you to offer your gifts to the world without sacrificing yourself in the process. The collective unconscious is real. Your access to it is real. Your ability to channel archetypal energy is real. But so is your individual life. So is your personal journey. So is the mundane, ordinary, embodied work of being human. Jung's vision of wholeness includes both, and so must yours. We're about to enter territory that will make the rationalist mind deeply uncomfortable. But Carl Jung didn't care about making rationalists comfortable. He cared about accurately describing observable phenomena, and one phenomenon he observed repeatedly, particularly in his own life and in the lives of his patients, was what he called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that seem to defy the laws of probability and causation. Jung defined synchronicity as the simultaneous occurrence of two meaningfully but not causally related events. When an inner psychological state corresponds with an outer physical event, in a way that seems far too precise to be random, but where there's no apparent causal mechanism connecting them. These aren't just coincidences, They're moments when the boundary between psyche and matter appears to dissolve, when inner and outer reality mirror each other in ways that feel impossible, yet undeniable. And if you're an INFJ, you know exactly what I'm talking about, because synchronicities follow you. They cluster around you with a frequency that makes you question consensus reality. You think of someone you haven't spoken to in years, and 3 minutes later, they call. You dream of a specific symbol, and the next day, it appears physically in your environment. You have an intuition about something, and external events confirm it in ways that seem orchestrated by an intelligence that shouldn't exist. Let me tell you about Maya. She had been estranged from her sister for 5 years, a painful, complete break after a family conflict that seemed irreparable. Maya had done extensive therapy around it, worked through her grief, accepted that the relationship was over, and then one morning, she woke up thinking about her sister, not the usual intrusive thoughts or rumination she'd worked through. This was different, a clear, strong, persistent presence in her consciousness. Her sister's energy, unmistakable and urgent. Maya tried to dismiss it, went about her morning routine, but the feeling intensified. Something was wrong, something was happening. Her knee was screaming at her in ways she couldn't ignore. And then, 3 minutes after she finally acknowledged the feeling, her phone rang. It was her sister, calling for the first time in 5 years. In crisis, needing help, Maya was simultaneously not surprised and completely shocked. Not surprised because her intuition had been correct, completely shocked because there was no rational explanation for how she could have known. Her sister hadn't reached out through mutual friends. There had been no warning, no causal mechanism, just a sudden, inexplicable knowing that corresponded exactly with external reality. This is synchronicity, and Jung spent decades trying to understand it, eventually proposing a radical theory that psyche and matter aren't as separate as we believe, that there's a dimension of reality, what he called the psychoid realm, where consciousness and physical events are interconnected in ways that transcend our usual understanding of causation, where meaning itself can organize events, can draw together inner and outer experiences through a principle he called a causal orderedness. For the skeptic, this sounds like magical thinking, like confirmation bias, pattern recognition run amok, the human tendency to find meaning in randomness. And Jung acknowledged these dangers. He was rigorous in his attempt to distinguish genuine synchronicity from mere coincidence or psychological projection. He insisted that synchronicity was rare, that most coincidences were just that, coincidences, and that the temptation to see meaningful connection everywhere was a form of inflation. But he also insisted, based on decades of empirical observation, that genuine synchronicity exists, that there are moments when reality genuinely bends around consciousness in ways that defy materialist explanation, and that certain individuals seem to be particularly prone to these experiences. INFJs are among those individuals, and the mechanism, from a Jungian perspective, makes sense. Your dominant introverted intuition is constantly accessing unconscious information. You're reading patterns below the threshold of conscious awareness. You're detecting subtle shifts in the collective unconscious. And somehow, in ways Jung could theorize about, but never fully explain, that unconscious perception creates a coherence between your inner state and outer events. It's as if your knee doesn't just observe reality, it participates in creating it. Or more accurately, it accesses a dimension where inner and outer reality are already unified, where the split between subject and object is an illusion, where consciousness and matter are two aspects of the same underlying reality. This is not New Age manifestation rhetoric. Jung explicitly rejected the idea that consciousness could simply create reality through positive thinking or intention. He wasn't saying you can manifest a parking space by visualizing it. He was saying something far more subtle and strange, that at the deepest levels of the psyche, at the level of the collective unconscious, there's a dimension where psychological and physical events correspond because they're emerging from the same source. Synchronicities, in Jung's view, are cracks in consensus reality, where this underlying unity becomes momentarily visible. They're evidence that our usual understanding of causation, that events in the world are caused only by prior physical events, is incomplete, that there's also meaning causation, where the significance of something draws it into manifestation. Now, here's where we have to be brutally careful, because synchronicity, like archetypal access, is incredibly susceptible to ego inflation. The moment you start believing that synchronicities happen because you're special, because you're chosen, because you have unique cosmic importance, you've crossed from genuine observation into grandiosity. Synchronicities don't happen because you're special. They happen because you're sensitive, because your nervous system is wired to detect subtle patterns, because your consciousness is permeable to the collective unconscious. This is a sensitivity, not a superiority. It's a capacity that carries both gifts and burdens. The gift is that synchronicities can guide you. They can provide confirmation when you're on the right path. They can offer information that conscious reasoning alone couldn't access. They can reveal connections and meanings that enrich your understanding of reality. The burden is that they can become addictive. You can start living for the next synchronicity instead of living your actual life. You can start interpreting everything as meaningful instead of discerning what's genuinely significant. You can lose contact with ordinary causation, with the fact that most of reality operates through predictable physical laws, and descend into magical thinking where everything is a sign, everything is connected, everything is orchestrated by cosmic intelligence. This is the edge INFJs have to walk. You do experience synchronicities more frequently than most people. That's not delusion, it's observable. But you also have to develop discernment. You have to distinguish between genuine synchronicity and the pattern-seeking tendencies of ni that will find meaning even in random events if you let it. Jung offered some criteria for identifying genuine synchronicity. First, there must be a strong emotional or psychological charge. Synchronicities aren't neutral. They feel significant, numinous, uncanny. They trigger something in the psyche that random coincidence doesn't. Second, there must be specificity. The more precise the correspondence between inner and outer events, the more likely it's genuine synchronicity. Maya's thought about her sister corresponding exactly with the phone call, that's specific. Thinking about communication in general and then receiving a call from anyone, that's vague. Third, there must be improbability. The events must be unlikely enough that chance explanation strains credulity. Not impossible, just improbable. This is where you have to be honest about the statistics of coincidence. Sometimes what feels synchronistic is actually just the law of large numbers at work. Fourth, there must be meaning beyond the surface. Genuine synchronicity carries transformative information. It shifts something in your psyche. It provides insight or direction that conscious reasoning couldn't access. If it's just a cool coincidence with no deeper significance, it's probably not synchronicity in Jung's sense. Using these criteria helps protect against the inflation trap, because the ego loves synchronicity. It loves the feeling of being cosmically connected, of having special access, of being in dialogue with an intelligent universe. And the more you feed that ego hunger, the more you start seeing synchronicity everywhere, the less discerning you become, the more you drift into magical thinking. I've fallen into this trap myself. There was a period where I was tracking synchronicities obsessively, writing them down, looking for patterns in the patterns, interpreting every coincidence as meaningful. and I felt spiritually elevated, cosmically connected, like I was tuned into frequencies others couldn't access. But really, I was using synchronicity as a way to avoid taking responsibility for my life through normal causation. Instead of making decisions and taking action, I was waiting for signs. Instead of doing the work, I was looking for cosmic confirmation. Instead of building my life through conscious effort, I was expecting reality to organize itself around my unconscious needs. A friend finally confronted me. "You're using synchronicity as a substitute for agency. You're so focused on reading the signs that you're not actually doing anything. You're passive, waiting for the universe to guide you instead of being an active participant in your own life." That was the wake-up call, because they were right. I had crossed from appreciating synchronicity as an occasional, meaningful phenomenon into living in a constant state of magical thinking where normal causation had been replaced by cosmic orchestration. The integration isn't rejecting synchronicity, it's putting it in its proper place. Synchronicity is real, but it's rare. It happens, but it's not the primary way reality operates. It offers guidance, but it doesn't absolve you of responsibility for making conscious choices and taking concrete action. Here's a practice Jung would likely approve of: synchronicity tracking for discernment. When something feels synchronistic, write it down immediately. Note the inner state, the outer event, the feeling quality, the specificity. Then here's the crucial part: wait. Give it time. See if the apparent meaning holds up over days and weeks, or if it was just emotional intensity in the moment. At the end of each month, review your synchronicity log. How many actually led to meaningful insight or transformation? How many were just interesting coincidences? How many were your pattern-seeking mind finding connections in randomness? This practice builds discernment. It trains you to recognize the difference between genuine synchronicity and magical thinking. There's another dimension to this that's crucial: synchronicity as message from the unconscious. Jung believed that synchronicities often occur when the unconscious is trying to communicate something the conscious mind isn't hearing. When you're psychologically blocked, when you're refusing to see something, when you're stuck in a pattern, the unconscious will sometimes engineer a synchronistic event that's so undeniable you have to pay attention. From this perspective, Maya's experience with her sister wasn't random cosmic orchestration. It was her unconscious, which had been processing her unfinished grief and her desire for reconciliation, creating a synchronistic moment that forced her conscious mind to confront what she'd been avoiding. The synchronicity was the unconscious's way of breaking through her resistance. This is a more psychologically sophisticated understanding of synchronicity. It's not that the universe is sending you messages. It's that your unconscious is using the universe to send messages to your consciousness. The boundary between inner and outer is more permeable than we think, and the unconscious has access to information and organizing principles that consciousness doesn't. Whether this happens through some quantum entanglement between psyche and matter, through collective unconscious coordination, or through mechanisms we don't yet understand, Jung admitted he didn't know. He could observe the phenomenon and theorize about it, but he couldn't fully explain it, and he was comfortable with that mystery. He believed consciousness needed to expand beyond materialist reductionism without collapsing into supernatural superstition. This is the middle path for INFJs, taking synchronicity seriously without taking it literally, recognizing it as a meaningful phenomenon without treating it as a replacement for conscious agency and rational causation, appreciating the mystery without inflating yourself with special cosmic importance, because here's the mature understanding: synchronicity isn't about you, it's about consciousness itself. It's evidence that reality is stranger, more interconnected, more meaningful than our usual materialist worldview allows. and you happen to have a nervous system that's sensitive to these moments of interconnection. That's not special, it's just your particular sensitivity. The question is, what will you do with that sensitivity? Will you use it to inflate your ego, to feel chosen and important? Will you use it to avoid taking responsibility, waiting for cosmic guidance instead of making conscious choices? Or will you use it, as Jung intended, as evidence of a deeper dimension of reality that calls you to greater consciousness, greater humility, greater participation in the mystery? There's a beautiful paradox here that Jung loved. The more you grasp for synchronicity, the less it appears. The more you try to force meaning, the more meaning withdraws. But when you live your life fully, consciously, engaged with both psychological depth and embodied action, synchronicity appears naturally, not as something you create or control, but as a byproduct of living in alignment with your deepest self. This is because genuine synchronicity emerges from psychic wholeness, when you're integrated, when you're living authentically, when there's coherence between conscious and unconscious. The boundary between inner and outer naturally becomes more permeable. Meaningful correspondences arise not because you're seeking them, but because you're embodying a level of consciousness that naturally participates in the dimension where psyche and matter interconnect. Jung called this living from the self, capital S. The self organizes synchronicities because the self exists at the level where inner and outer are unified. The ego can observe synchronicities, can be amazed by them, can learn from them, but it can't create them. That's the self's domain. So the practice isn't to seek more synchronicities. It's to become more whole, to integrate your shadows, to align with your authentic path, to live consciously and courageously. And then synchronicities will appear, not as rewards for being special, but as confirmations that you're aligned, as course corrections when you're veering off path, as invitations to deepen into mystery. Let me offer one final story. An INFJ I knew was agonizing over a major life decision, whether to leave a secure career to pursue creative work. They had analyzed it rationally from every angle, had done the psychological work, had consulted with trusted others, but still felt stuck, unable to commit. And then, on the morning they had scheduled to make their final decision, they opened a book at random and found this Jung quote: "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." At the exact moment they read it, a bird flew into their window, which had never happened before, carrying a twig in its beak, building a nest, creating a home. The synchronicity was undeniable. The specificity, the timing, the multiple layers of meaning, all converging. They took it as confirmation, quit their job, pursued the creative path, and it was hard, financially difficult, emotionally challenging, but also deeply right. The synchronicity hadn't promised ease. It had confirmed alignment. That's what synchronicity offers. Confirmation of alignment, not guarantee of outcome. It doesn't protect you from difficulty. It doesn't ensure external success. It just confirms that you're on your path, that you're living in accordance with your deepest truth, that the universe, or the unconscious, or consciousness itself, recognizes your authenticity. And for INFJs, that confirmation can be crucial because you live so much in your intuition, so much in possibility and potential, that you can paralyze yourself with uncertainty. Synchronicity cuts through that paralysis. It provides a signal clear enough that even your doubting mind can't entirely dismiss it. But, and this is crucial, it only works if you're doing the work, if you're living consciously, if you're taking responsibility, if you're engaged in your actual life rather than waiting passively for cosmic guidance. Synchronicity supports active engagement. It doesn't substitute for it. Comment below, aligned, if you've experienced undeniable synchronicity, and you're ready to receive it with humility rather than inflation, if you're ready to let it guide without controlling, if you're ready to participate in the mystery without claiming to understand it. Because that's what synchronicity asks of you, participation in something larger than your ego can comprehend, without the ego claiming ownership of it, living in wonder without collapsing into magical thinking, recognizing meaning without insisting everything is meaningful. This is the consciousness Jung pointed toward, not materialist reductionism that dismisses synchronicity as delusion, and not New Age inflation that treats synchronicity as evidence of your cosmic specialness, but a middle path that recognizes reality is stranger than our models allow. Consciousness participates in that strangeness, and you happen to be sensitive to it. Use that sensitivity wisely. Let it enrich your life without defining your identity. Let it guide without replacing your agency. Let it humble you with mystery rather than inflating you with importance. That's the path. That's the integration. That's what turns synchronicity from ego food into genuine wisdom,